Now, I'm not so naive to think that I have all the answers, but here's my attempt to at least try to diagnose some of what went wrong in the Virginia election after Democrats lost their races for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, while also losing their majority in the House of Delegates. So here's my take on this with some reasons in no particular order. And I'd be remiss not to start with the ineffectiveness that we're seeing from national Democrats, because let's face it, we're in control right now. And I'll just say that it's not great when you have majorities in the House, the Senate, and the White House, and we're almost a year in, and yet we're still arguing about passing stuff like lowering prescription drug prices, which polls at about 90%, and that's what the voters see. Remember, not everyone is tuning in every day. Not everyone is following every inch of negotiations. And so when they do tune in, they're seeing dysfunction. They're seeing an inability to pass even the most popular provisions, like lowering prescription drug prices, all despite knowing that we have majorities all throughout government. And so that we're clear, that's not on the progressives. And so, of course, I can guarantee you that we're going to see hot takes where people pile on progressives, that progressives should have stopped being so greedy and just taken the bipartisan infrastructure package so that something gets passed. Which, so that we're clear, is bullshit. Biden didn't run on an agenda of fixing only roads and bridges. That's not the mandate on which he was elected. Biden was elected because he promised to combat climate change, which is in the Build Back Better Act. He promised to extend the child tax credit and try to make it permanent, which is in the Build Back Better Act. He promised to fund elder care and to offer universal pre-K and housing and pandemic preparedness programs and ACA subsidies and college grants, all of which are in the Build Back Better Act. And granted, not everything that he promised is in the bill, to be sure, but the point remains that the vast majority of what he ran on is in the bill. And we all know that if those two bills, the infrastructure package and the Build Back Better Act, were delinked, suddenly Manchin would call for a pause. So of course they're going to hold out on voting on the infrastructure package, because holding out is their only leverage. And once they lose their leverage, the bill that Americans want won't get passed. The progressives are the only ones doing the bidding of the American people. So for those claiming that the Manchins and Sinemas of the party are the sober, responsible ones, that doesn't bear a shred of resemblance to reality. And onto the messaging front, it's even worse. Republicans made this race a referendum on critical race theory, which is to say, on something that does not exist in K-12 schools. They managed to make it a referendum on a non-existent phenomenon. And they did it with the help of a media that is so desperate to prove that it's not the liberal media that it falls over itself to legitimize whatever bullshit talking points the Republicans put forward. There was one outlet that posed the question in polling about parents having more of a say over what their kids learn in schools. That question is predicated on critical race theory, on teaching something that isn't being taught. And yet the media is happy to whitewash this lie, this non-existent phenomenon, by framing it as an issue of education. The number of times that we've heard about education versus the number of times you've heard the media admit that critical race theory isn't a thing in K-12 schools goes to show that when Republicans air disinformation, the media not only fails to rebut it, they actually help Republicans by whitewashing it to sound like a reasonable position. And this isn't even new. Think back to how many times Benghazi was on the front page of every single news outlet, because Republicans simply couldn't stomach the idea of 4 Americans needlessly dying. And now remind me how many Americans died from COVID, and yet miraculously, no outrage, no calls for investigations on the right, no demands for accountability. In fact, it's the opposite. They are helping kill them by spreading disinformation like their careers depend on it, leading to Republicans being 5 times more likely to be victims of COVID in this country. And the same media outlets who took the bait when Republicans pretended to be so utterly torn up over 4 dead Americans don't seem to mind that the GOP has suddenly lost their sympathy. Imagine that. Or what about Hillary's emails? Another front page story on every news outlet. No greater threat to national security than when Hillary Clinton used a personal email for sensitive government business. And yet when Ivanka Trump sent hundreds of emails to White House aides, cabinet officials, and her assistants using a personal account, the story came and went like a fart in a hurricane. No calls for investigations, no wall-to-wall media coverage, nothing. Why? Because Republicans weren't dictating that the media discuss it, and so the media didn't discuss it. Because the media doesn't determine its own coverage, they let Republicans and their faux outrage do it for them every single time. And so now, rest assured that Republicans are going to feel validated in this strategy, a strategy of pretending that kids are being indoctrinated by critical race theory that quite literally is not being taught. But the facts don't actually matter, the media narrative does. They say whatever they want, and it's echoed 100-fold by conservative pundits on Fox and Newsmax and OAN that solely exist to promote disinformation that benefits them politically. We have no equivalent on the left, nor should we. But Democrats need to stop getting caught flat-footed every single election cycle when Republicans Republicans lie about something and it becomes the defining issue of the campaign, and we bang our heads against the desk wondering where we went wrong or why we didn't control the narrative. And look, it could be all of those things, it could be none of those things. It could be the fact that Glenn Youngkin ran against Terry McAuliffe, and Terry McAuliffe ran against Trump. It could be that voters are tired of hearing about Trump and that he's not an effective boogeyman in a state that really didn't see this election as being a referendum on him. It could be that Republican voters saw the critical race theory argument as thinly veiled racism and that they simply responded well to that. Or maybe, quite simply, this was an issue of Democratic complacency, and in a state that's voted the opposite of the party in power all but one time in the last 44 years, we shouldn't look too much into it. It could be all of those, it could be none of those. But what we do know is that we have work to do. We have work to do legislatively, and we have work to do with regard to messaging. And this should serve as a 5-alarm fire for Democrats if they don't figure out how to get some legislation passed and deliver for the people that elected them. And I know that we're dealing with razor-thin majorities, and that while we need 100% sign-on, that Republicans are effectively absolved of all culpability, that not a single Republican on the right is helping pass any of this. But that is the reality that we live in. So we need to figure it out, even if that means locking Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in a room together and telling them to get it done. Because the future of not just our party, but women's reproductive rights, workers' rights, and our democracy and the planet rely on seeing that something is not working and fixing it before it's too late. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.